Hey, I'm Pippin. If you don't know me, I make digital art games, so weird web games mostly. And what I wanted to talk about this evening is the relationship between code and games, and kind of the way that code influences the experience and interacts with the other parts of the game. So yeah, particularly thinking about experience and aesthetics. So when we make our own games, it's kind of like getting this privileged insight into kind of, what's really going on inside the world of the game, right? And it kind of feels like we have control over the very building blocks of games and the central properties of mechanics and rules and events and actions and all of these sorts of things. And it feels sort of really powerful, I guess, and it feels like we could kind of do anything that we want by typing in the magic words and pressing compile. But of course it doesn't always do what you expected, right? You get some surprises. And I think that that's in no small part because the tools that we use and the code that we use, code and computation, have a kind of agency of their own in the game making process. And so sometimes it's a bit like the code is making the game as much as we are. And that's kind of what I want to focus on here. So the very first game that I made is this one. This is Guru Quest. And so the idea was that you would leave your little house, walk across these hills, and then go to a temple where you would meet a guru who you could ask anything that you wanted. So the thing that was really important to me was that you could ask anything of the guru. There was no constraint on the player. So I wanted the player to be able to say anything, and so to do that I wanted them basically to be able to type questions or statements to the guru that the guru would respond to. But of course, in doing that, you have to sacrifice a lot of control over the process because you don't know what the player is going to say. And so you have to think about how you're going to deal with that situation and still create an interesting experience. So you can't define a narrative, and so the best way to do this maybe is with a chatbot, and so that's what I decided to use. And I used a chatbot called Eliza. This is what some of Eliza's script looks like, and Eliza's default personality, which you might be able to see here, is that she acts like a psychotherapist. And she has this very basic trick, which is that she matches keywords in your sentences that you type in, and then she tries to kind of reflect back to you so that she doesn't really add anything to the conversation, she tries to provoke you to keep talking. And so I wanted to make a guru that sort of worked in that sort of way, so I wanted to change Eliza into a sort of spiritual guru instead of a psychotherapist. It's not too much of a reach, actually, I think. And so I needed to kind of change Eliza by making her more philosophical and mystical and obtuse. So I wanted to embrace this chatbot thing, right? This underlying code and the way that this code works. So what's the meaning of life then, is an obvious question. Why ask, is what the guru might respond to you, right? And it's sort of deep and meaningful, and yet it's just using that same trick, right? It's like it found out that you used the word "what" at the start of your question, realized it was a question, and then made some kind of glib response that makes you feel small and insignificant. But the best thing about the guru, right, is that it has this kind of superpower, which is that a guru can say anything, and it will be wise and deep and insightful because it's a guru, right? Like that's what a guru does. And that kind of completely saves you from the player, because players will say stupid things to the guru, pizza or pasta, and it's hard for, you can't plan for the situation, or you can, but not for all of them. Because the guru can say anything, you can actually incorporate non sequiturs. This is the only world we have. And we have to assume that that's deep and meaningful, and it reflects on this sort of trivial question of like, oh, pizza or pasta. Maybe you should actually be thinking about the world and impermanence. But you really only come up with this trick, right, by thinking about how that underlying code works and kind of trying to work with Eliza rather than against her. So the first sort of theme is then teamwork, because it's often tempting to think about coding as if it's this exercise in pure expressiveness. Like we can do whatever we want, we just type in the words, and then the thing that we envisaged comes into being. But that's really naive. We're in a partnership with the code that we use and the frameworks and the tools. They're doing it with us. And often it's a good idea to kind of embrace that kind of teamwork with your tools, because sometimes your code has a vision as well, and it might be better than your one. We probably all agree that code can kind of make beautiful things. We've all seen it. I'm not necessarily arguing that this is beautiful. This is just sine waves. But I think it's also possible for kinds of software engineering systems and things that we think of maybe as kind of boring technical stuff to also have a real aesthetic impact as well. And so I made a series of games with the performance artist Marina Abramovich. This is from that. Where we turned some of these exercises that she does to prepare for her performance works into games. And the kind of serendipitous thing that happened with that is that I used a bunch of kind of boring technical things to sort of make these games a reality, but those boring technical things had really interesting aesthetic implications as well. Like, they weren't actually just behind the scenes. So this game is called Counting the Rice and Sesame. It's downstairs if you want to take part. And you do exactly as you would think. So rice and sesame seeds fall from the sky, and you pick them up and you put them into these cups and you count them. And that's the exercise. And so it's obviously a kind of an exercise in focus and meditation, being immersed in a task, feeling kind of peaceful. But it's also a game that uses the Box 2D physics engine, which is a really good physics engine for 2D, arguably. And it was really interesting to use this kind of very technical back-end sort of thing that you would normally think about maybe for physics puzzles or action games or platformers. It was interesting to use that, in fact, to just implement this kind of peaceful, very simple activity that doesn't try and push it to the max or whatever. But it was the very use of the physics engine, I think, that lends the poetry to the interaction, right? The way that things move through the air or sway or bounce is what's nice about the game, and I think what helps you to feel like you're playing something interesting and maybe artistic. Complaining to a Tree is another of these games, so you can also see that downstairs. Again, very sort of straightforward title, so you find a tree, like this tree, from a menu system, and then you complain to it, so you tell it your problems. So as you can see, a dialog box comes up, and you say something to the tree, and then you press enter, and the tree listens to you, and the tree doesn't judge you because the tree doesn't say anything because it's a tree. But using the dialog box, right, which is this very basic kind of interaction design, UI, toolkit sort of thing, that's really what makes this work, I think, again, because we have all of these associations with this piece of technology, and it adds to this feeling of sort of communication, communion, sending something into the game, and expressing ourselves. So again, boring technical thing is actually what makes this work. So those Abramovich method games, for me, all kind of variously emphasize the idea that the code itself is able to support a kind of deeper aesthetic meaning. So whether it's a flocking algorithm, which you see in one of the games, a physics engine, a dialog box, all of these programming elements become part of what can make something beautiful and interesting. So I think that's worth thinking about. This is a more recent game. This is Get X, Avoid Y. Again, pretty good title. So you're trying to get the X's and avoid the Y's as they move around on the screen. And the game is invented as a kind of formal experiment in the distinction between code and aesthetics, and this idea that the code is where the real game is, and that the aesthetics are kind of, window dressing. I mean, I know we all know that this isn't true, but sometimes you hear radicals saying that that's the way that games work. And so what I wanted to do is keep the game code completely stable, so it's just this game, and then change the images and see how things change when you play the game. So if you replace the X's with Tom Cruise's head, and the Y's with Katie Holmes' head, and the particle effects become L. Ron Hubbard, and you've got Hollywood in the background, it's like it's a really different game, right? Like, it's no longer the same sort of game that we were seeing. It's about something different. It's like, now it's a commentary on Scientology or something. But there are also mechanical differences that come about because of the fact that we changed the images. It's not just a narrative overlay. You could argue that this game is maybe harder because there's so much visual confusion now, because the particles are bigger, they're occluding things, the background is noisy, Tom Cruise and Katie Holmes look very similar for some reason, and so on, right? So it changes the way that the game itself works. And so get X avoid Y became a series of experiments in looking at these kinds of effects, basically. So you could exaggerate the idea of making a game harder by changing the images. So if you make the things long and thin, they become a lot harder to click on. Because of the way that the rotation works, the ends of the thin thing move really, really quickly, right? So they're harder to access. So you have to try and click them in the middle. So it becomes a more difficult game. You could embrace the idea of a political statement by making the drone warfare version of get X, avoid Y. But you could maintain a kind of mechanical connection again so that it's not just a cheap overlay by making the enemies and friendlies look very, very similar. So maybe it's a commentary on targeting and how it's quite difficult to actually distinguish the people that you're trying to kill. Another thing that the game does towards the end is kind of totally loses coherence. And it just randomly loads stuff into the different components. So the X's and the Y's, the particle effects, the background can just be mashed up in any combination. And I think that it kind of does two things. One, it obviously emphasizes that the code does not care what the game looks like, right? It's perfectly happy to just wave this through. Yeah, that's fine, that's the game. But I think it also reaffirms this idea that there is this really strong, interesting relationship between the code and the aesthetics and the way that that all works together, and the way that it looks is really important and changes the game that you're playing. So the code isn't everything, right? Like you can have the same code and have radically different games. It isn't where the real game lives. The real game is in this gestalt of, player, code, sound, images, everything comes together into this ecosystem that we need to kind of embrace, I think. This game you probably have never played, but it's called Leaderboarder. And what you do is you register on this leaderboard on this nice yellow page by typing in your name, like that. And then you start playing, and it's actually a multiplayer game, so it's a live updating web page. So you can see multiple people playing at the same time, and you just adjust your score upwards to go up the leaderboard. And if there's multiple people playing, you can see their scores moving up and down. You can click the minus button next to their score so that their score goes down instead of up, and that's it. So it's like a competitive multiplayer game without a game. It's just a leaderboard. It's a fun game, like I liked it. But then I posted it on Reddit. And Reddit does things differently. So I learned that amazing lesson that JavaScript is not secure, and interesting things will happen to your code. So sadly, the game isn't really active anymore, so you can't see what it was like when the war was on. But this is what it looks like now in its kind of dead static form. So hundreds of people flooded in and just started messing with the game with code. So the first thing that they did was they used auto-clickers. So there's code on their computer that would tell the game that they were clicking way, way faster than they really were. So you would just see people's scores just shoot up like super, super fast. And that was one way that they could do it. But the really interesting thing was that people started to just program the game themselves. They would open the console in their browser and just start typing JavaScript in. And the obvious thing that they did is they just typed in set score to 10 billion, and it worked because JavaScript is not secure, and it didn't really do anything about that as an issue. And so they would just set their scores up. But the really smart people and the really interesting thing that happened is that people wrote scripts to play the game for them. All kinds of scripts. The most obvious one, of course, is that people wrote scripts to be the best. So they would write a script that would monitor their score, and if anybody was above them, then they would move their score up. And I actually saw two of these fighting each other at the top of the leaderboard, and they were just blurring backwards and forth like this, just up and down, each one swapping as it realized that somebody had passed it on the leaderboard, and just fighting forever, basically. So by the end, there was basically nobody playing the game. There was just me kind of checking in. But there were all of these scripts just constantly messing with the game, reordering the entire page, competing to be at the top, competing to be at the bottom, like I am worst, the best worst player of the game. So there was nobody there. There was just code playing, and that was pretty crazy. So the code of our games often isn't just ours. Whether we're working with deeply insecure JavaScript, or somebody decompiles our web games so they can see the hidden ending maybe, or we've gone open source and we want people to work with our code. Like, it's out there, like people can get there and they can bring their own code and do stuff as well. So to recap, code is not some kind of magic incantation where the dream game that we imagine becomes a reality. It's kind of more like our working partner. It's somebody we collaborate with and have fights with. The language that we use, the libraries, the tools, all of these things matter, like making a guru with a chatbot. Our code has expressive qualities of its own. It's not just a static behind-the-scenes thing, and we can embrace that, like meditating with a physics engine or talking to a dialog box. And our code isn't the be-all and end-all of the process where the real game lives. It's part of an overall thing, and that's really important to realize, whether it's drone attacks or Tom Cruise's spinning head. And our code isn't even just ours. We're not the sole author. It's out there, and people are working with it, making it better, subverting it, trying to break it, turning it into an apocalyptic wasteland like Leaderboard was. And it's all of these things that I think are amazing about games and are amazing about being able to work with code. That everything is interwoven. The code, the graphics, the sound, the players. Everything is this big, sort of interesting, weird ecosystem that we don't control, and that we kind of collaborate with to make the games that we want to make. And I think that that's a really beautiful thing. Thanks. Do we have time for questions?
Of course.
Does anybody have a single? No, nobody ever asks me questions, so let's just get this over with. Anybody have a question? Question?
Give us a moment.
Why is nobody asking you a question?
I know,
We're all trying to think, okay?
Think. All right.
Don't give us this much responsibility, please.
Oh, yay, okay.
Are you just going to answer with why ask?
Maybe. Try me. Oh, I answered it then.
No.
Maybe. The guru says maybe a lot, actually.
Ultimately false.
What was that?
Your answer was ultimately false.
Ultimately false.
Yeah, because you said maybe, and the answer was like. You
No, because that's just a
So
probable.
you should have said no.
It's a probabilistic statement. I might have, but I didn't. So
Why should we ask you a question?
why should you? No, you don't have to. I'm amazed by how few questions anybody ever asks at the end of these things.
Your collaboration.
I'm not accusing you. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Your collaboration with Marina Abramovic. How does this work? How does this work? Is she? Is she feeding you with content or?
Well, it was pretty interesting because she's super busy because she's like world famous performance artist. So really, I only met her in person a couple of times, and then we talked on Skype and emailed and stuff like that. But she was basically, the great thing about her was she was really hands-off, because I'm not necessarily the best collaborative person. So she kind of told me, I'm kind of interested in some games. I said, what about these games? And she said, yeah, those games, that's great. And then I made those games, and she was like, thanks. And then that was it. It was exactly like that. Yeah.
So she likes to work further with you together?
Yeah. I mean, they're keeping open the connection, like, see what happens. I mean, it was exhausting doing it, so I don't know if I want to keep doing it, but yeah, it was super interesting as a collaboration.
So,
I think you and the back there had.
Why is stepping on the ground only playable between 6 and 7 a.m.?
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to ask Marina. That's when she thinks you should do it, so that's why. Yeah, I don't know. I mean.
So I actually I like your point about authorship of code. I hadn't really thought about that, like in any.
That seems really related to you guys, especially with Nuclear Throne, right?
Yeah.
The way that you guys interact with it.
Yeah, exactly. But like, it still always feels as ours. Which, like, do you think that is something really specific to code, or is that actually just common in media? Like,
maybe that's just an authorship, the illusion of authorship that we all have as the people who think that we control everything. But it really feels like, especially with you guys, like they are almost writing the code.
Yeah, they're helping, absolutely.
Yeah, it's interesting.
It sort of set me on a path. I'm like, wait, like, do I own our code or do I not? I would actually be very interested in seeing a game about that now that I think about it.
Let's do it. Let's collaborate, because I'm a great collaborator.
I will just tell you to make that game.
Okay,
then we
that'll work.
Yeah,
okay, I'm on it.
Call that a good
I'm on
collaboration.
it. It's next on my list.
Good.
Yeah, we'll be make a game together?
Yes.
Like that?
Yes. I thought we were going to make like an angry diagramming tool.
Can I just point out that it's really
Well, that'd be great.
Can I just point out that's really cool that there's like time to do your part in saving the planet?
I know, isn't that awesome? Everybody pay attention.
All of a sudden,
yeah, there it is. That's my final message to you, because I should probably finish. Thank you.
What a guru.